on time. I appreciate you. I would just want to welcome Trita Parsi onto the show from the Quincy Institute. We've had him a number of times. Great analysis. Trita, I want to get right to it. You proposed the theory a few weeks ago when you came on our show, and you mentioned about you believe that the best course of action would be for Trump to retreat from the situation. This would kind of leave Iran in a kind of complex situation where they don't have sanctions relief. Since then, things have escalated quite a lot. What's your kind of perspective on what's happening now?
Again, great to be with you again, Sulaiman. Let me just clarify. I didn't advocate for that position, and I didn't think it would be the best outcome for the U.S. or for Iran. I said, though, that I think that would likely end up being the scenario for a variety of reasons in which it would be the least cost to Trump, even though he doesn't get the most benefit. But he kind of went in that direction, and then he kind of screwed himself up by going for the blockade. Because the blockade of the blockade caused oil prices to go up again. So the benefit he got from the ceasefire, he erased with the blockade of the blockade without getting any concessions from the Iranians. In fact, not bringing them to their knees and all of those different things. So he kind of went in the direction that I thought he would, but then he shot himself in the foot a couple of times. And that has kind of made the situation worse, and part of the reason why, in some ways, it actually led to a scenario in which the U.S. is in greater need of a diplomatic deal than had he not done the blockade. Sorry, go ahead.
No, sorry, go ahead.
So, but with the situation right now, of course, is that there's been some very significant progress made in the talks. But once again, you have this exchange of fire. You also have the rhetoric coming out of Trump that is highly problematic. I don't know exactly how the exchange of fire started, whether it was the Iranians, whether it was the U.S., but all of that is complicating matters at a very crucial moment in which there was a likelihood of a breakthrough, not in the sense of getting a deal, but getting to a new plateau, perhaps a memorandum. And from Trump's perspective, this would have been extremely helpful because he's on his way to Beijing next week. And if he doesn't have this situation under control, not resolved it, but under control, he will arrive there in great embarrassment.
Yeah, and he's going Beijing on the 14th, and things are really complex at the moment for him. You mentioned how it's a lot more difficult. How can he get to a deal, though? Because it seems like things are escalating. He's getting pressure from the Gulf states. He's getting pressure from Israel. In addition to that, from his own perspective, you mentioned quite accurately that things have escalated to a point now where it's a lot more difficult for him to A, walk away, and so B, he needs a deal. But the problem with the deal has always been that, I think you said they're close. I want to hear what aspects you believe they're close, because from my understanding that they're always so far apart, like US is just so redlined in what they want that they're never movable in these kind of negotiations.
No, I think you're right. I think that the kind of public negotiation is very unhelpful because it leads to a scenario in which, you position yourself in a way, even if it's a negotiating tactic, then everyone's going to compare the outcome, the final outcome, to the rhetoric you had. And if you're making maximalist demands rhetorically, then it's going to look as if you failed in the negotiations because you're not going to achieve those, even though you may actually have been very happy with the outcome and you never actually believed in your maximalist position. So it's one thing to be maximalist at the table. It's a different thing to also be maximalist in the rhetoric. And I think it's been unhelpful for both sides to do some of these things. But there has been some progress on some of the issues pertaining to the nuclear issue. But none of those things are finalized until everything else is finalized. But it means that flexibility has been shown. And one thing we should not forget, and I think I've said it on your show as well, there is a trump card that Trump has that the other presidents did not. It is not that he's willing to use military force. I think at this point, the threat of military force simply doesn't have the same potency as it did before, given how this war ended up. It's rather that he's actually really willing to lift all sanctions. He is not attached to these sanctions in any way, shape, or form. There's a lot of sanctions worshipping going on in previous negotiations, in which there was a greater fear of lifting some sanctions than there was a fear of failing at the negotiations. So the U.S. side tended to, stick with the sanctions even at the detriment of U.S. interests and the prospects of a deal. Trump doesn't have that. He doesn't like sanctions. Sanctions punish American companies, in his view. He's actually been very consistent about that since the beginning of his campaign back in 2015. So here the Iranians have someone who is actually ideologically opposed to sanctions and is willing to lift a lot of sanctions, which then obviously requires that the Iranians give much more on the nuclear issue than they were willing to give before, because back then far less was on the table from the US side.
But what would that look like? And I guess this is the $1 million question, because, like, speaking to people from Iran, experts, or even some of the negotiators, they kind of seem to suggest that any scenario where there's a basically they're not allowed to enrich at all, whether it's 5 years, 12 years, 20 years, is a no go for them. The percentage I always feel like they're very open to, like they're willing to go down to like a decent percentage, which will make Trump happy. But it's the that bit. I believe that that's the aspect where there's always this kind of barrier. What's your thoughts on this?
I think you're absolutely right. There's certain red lines on the nuclear issue that they will never give up entirely. So zero enrichment permanently will never happen. The fact that the conversations actually have pertain to specific years in which the Iranians wouldn't enrich is a significant give by the Iranians. So in the Geneva negotiations, the de facto outcome of that deal, if it had been agreed upon by the US, is that the Iranians would not have enriched for about 5 to 7 years. But it's not that they would say that there's a moratorium or that they're agreeing not to enrich. The way they would be fixed is that they would only enrich based on needs of 2 identified reactors, the TRR and another reactor that is not even online for another 7 years. They already have fuel for the TRR for another 5 to 7 years, which means that they essentially agreed we would only enrich to produce fuel pads for these 2 reactors. And these 2 reactors already have fuel pads for about 7 years. So it's not that they're giving up. It's not that they're agreeing to a moratorium. It's just saying, well, we don't need to do it right now. Nevertheless, despite how this has been finessed, it is a significant give. They also had agreed in Geneva not to have any stockpile at all, which means that as soon as they enrich, they would immediately turn it into fuel pads. They would never sit on a large number of kilos of enriched uranium, which is the material that you then also can use for nuclear weapons. So those are already significant gives that they have given, not beyond these like impossible red lines. The question is, what will they get in return? And I think Trump is very open on the sanctions relief, but Trump is also insisting on longer timelines, 12, 15, 20 years. And he also wants to make sure that the existing stockpile of higher enriched uranium at 60%, the whereabouts of which may not be entirely known, it's the stuff that Trump tried to bomb into oblivion, needs to be completely given up and shipped out. And that is right now a major stumbling block.
Yeah. But what about the Lebanon issue? Because I feel like that's another one that would cause. It's very difficult for Trump to make that deal because you've got a third actor, which is Israel, involved. How could he get that agreement? Iran is insistent that Lebanon will be included in any deal.
Actually, there's some symmetry there because the US has demands of the Iranians making sure that Iraqi militias don't do certain things, that Hezbollah doesn't do certain things, that the Houthis don't do certain things. So the proposal that has been on the table, or the idea essentially, has been a complete end to the conflict that also encompasses Israel and also encompasses some of these other groups or organizations. For the Iranians to sign an agreement with the US that does not include Israel has its pluses and its minuses. On the one hand, the minus is that the Israelis may attack again. But the plus is that if there is such an agreement and the Israelis do choose to attack, they will do so without the United States. And the Israelis, frankly, will not go to war with Iran without the United States, at least not under the current circumstances. So if they were to choose to go in that direction without US support, they would have separated themselves from the American side. But the Iranians are nevertheless insisting on including Israel in all of this because of several different reasons. They want to see that the United States actually is willing and has the ability to constrain Israel. It's very crucial because it's not whether the Israelis would just attack Iran. It's that if the Israelis are attacking these other countries in its neighborhood, it's an immediate neighborhood, there is always a risk of a spillover that would lead to a regional war in which not only the Israelis, but the US would get dragged into that war as well. And that would then neutralize the agreement with the United States. So I think the Iranians are going to be very firm on this point. And it doesn't seem, again, that this is a point that Trump has some sort of a ideological opposition to. Other presidents would. They would be like, well, Israel has a right to defend itself, so it needs to be able to take out Hezbollah, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not saying that Trump is soft on Hezbollah. We're seeing what the U.S. is doing right now and pushing the Lebanese government almost to the brink of a civil war in order to disarm Hezbollah. But at the same time, if Trump gets what he wants on his issues, he has shown in the past a greater willingness than other presidents to put real pressure on Israel. What he hasn't shown is the ability to put that pressure on Israel in a sustained manner. So it's actually kept and it becomes a stable situation.
And that's going to be the $1 million question, because I just can't see Trump having the ability to constrain Israel in its entirety in terms of not trying to occupy Lebanon or not bombing Lebanon. Every ceasefire involving Israel has resulted, and this is again an important part for Iran, because you can agree to a ceasefire, but we saw Gaza is continuing to be bombed almost every single day. Lebanon was bombed throughout 2024 when the
and it would also kind of pull Iran into some of those things because it's going to continue to support Hezbollah if Israel is attacking Hezbollah. But on the first part of it, you said that you don't think Trump can do it or will do it. Will do it, I may agree with you. Perhaps he won't. Can do it? Absolutely. Any American president absolutely can put that pressure on Israel if they choose to do so. It is the superpower in this equation at the end of the day, even though oftentimes they seem to forget that. And we have plenty of examples in which American presidents have done so. Reagan, chewed out Menachem Begin in '82 over Israel's invasion of Lebanon. And on nightly news, Americans saw what Israel was doing. And at one point then said, I'm not going to sell you the F-16s if you don't pull out. Within 20 minutes, Begin called back and said, we're pulling out of Lebanon. So the U.S. absolutely can do so. There's a bit of a approach by some of the pro-Israeli entities in Washington in which they're kind of spreading this narrative as if the U.S. doesn't have that ability, as if, that leverage doesn't exist, even though Israel cannot conduct a war for more than 5 days without active American support. It's because if you believe that it's impossible, you're not even going to consider that as an option. It's a way of disempowering everyone else.
That's a great point. I guess what U.S. in a logical sense has the ability. They're the superpower. Israel is in complete reliance of the U.S. But what we also know is that decision making when it comes to Washington is very much directed and even possibly controlled by Israel. Many of us predicted this war was going to happen because of that reason, because it was never America's interest. They were very close to a deal. The deal you're speaking about now, America was actually going to get a much better deal on February the 27th. And we knew they were going to go to war because of this Israeli direction. But I guess I mean it from that perspective. But totally agree with what you said there. Now, I guess what we're seeing in the Strait now is a huge buildup. We're seeing the UAE being involved. It's 8 waves of attacks on the UAE. The UAE claimed that it was Iran. Iran saying it wasn't them. You then have Saudi and Kuwait, basically according to reports, saying that you're not allowed to use our airspace because we're not happy with your response in terms of Trump about the UAE, because he said it doesn't meet the escalation ladder. And then Trump got on the phone allegedly with Saudi Arabia. They had a discussion and Saudi and Kuwait said you can now use our airspace. It seems to be that he may have conceded, he may have agreed, and possibly the bombing yesterday on Bandar Abbas, Tariq, and Keshem was based on that, although could have also been because of the Strait, and then he said it's because of that. What's your entire thoughts on the Gulf states kind of possibly pushing this war, UAE pushing this war, Trump desperate for a deal? The reports were that they're actually angry with Trump because they feel like he's too desperate for a deal. What's your thoughts on that kind of perspective?
Look, when something is not going well, you will have a lot of anger in all kinds of directions. And that's what is happening right now. This war is a debacle for the United States. It is a debacle for the states that pushed for it within the JCC. And it's also not been particularly good in any way, shape, or form, for the states that very ferociously and heroically pushed against this war. And it has dramatically intensified divisions within the GCC, because many of them do believe that the Emirates was actively pushing for this war. There is plenty of reporting. I have, in my own conversations with the US government, reached the conclusion that they are absolutely right, that MBS himself actively pushed for this war, even though the Saudi foreign ministry may have pushed against it. And now they're in a situation in which they have seen throughout the war, but also specifically in the last couple of days, that the United States does not care about their security. Because in the war, the United States put, at least from their perspective, almost all of its efforts in making sure that Israel was protected. But the same level of protection was not at all provided to the GCC states. Even American bases, in their view, received less protection than Israel itself did. Moreover, many of them pushed against this war, but it seems like the only opinion he seemed to have really cared about was that of Benjamin Netanyahu. So they've seen that Trump does not seem to care that much, does not coordinate with them, and then they end up paying the price for the war without the protection that the United States, or they at least believe the United States would provide them with. And then you have Project Freedom, which apparently lasted 48 or so hours. Within that project, the US escalates without coordinating with the Saudis and others. It wasn't the lack of coordination that was the main problem. The main problem, I think, was that they saw that when the Iranians retaliated and struck the UAE, the US side said this was not a very significant confrontation, and it did not breach the ceasefire. And you did not see, at least at that time, any retaliation by the United States against against Iran. So these states within the GCC then say, whether it actually is because they want more war or it's because they want a deal, their perspective is whatever direction the US goes, they lose. If there is a war, they get hit without getting protection from the US. If there is a deal, Trump will make a deal that is good for him without taking much consideration into their interest. Part of this is endemic. It's endemic in the sense that if you, as a much smaller state, put all of your eggs in the security basket of that other country, you are at the mercy of that other country. And it may be a little bit, not that you're not legitimate in some of your criticism, but it's a little bit, well, you chose that relationship. And that relationship brings with it certain realities. When you didn't balance, when you didn't diversify, and you made yourself vulnerable to that superpower, and that superpower has now, as of late, been remarkably unreliable, what did you expect? In many ways, it's the same experience that Europe itself has. It put all of its eggs in the American security basket. It even deepened its own dependency on the United States after the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, and then is stunned that it is now so dependent on the United States and treated in the manner that it is. I think the one example that I think is particularly poignant is the German chancellor, who supported this war, who said that Israel is doing Europe's dirty work for it, who said that Iran, that international law, who sat in the White House, in the Oval Office, just days after Trump started the war and nodded along, facilitating America's worst instincts. And now when the war is going terribly, he's actually criticizing the war and criticizing Trump. Legitimate criticisms in many ways. But he's not really in a position to criticize as if he doesn't bear any responsibility. He supported this war. But this is what that type of a dependency does. It turns what used to be a very good ally, an ally that stood up against the Iraq war very heroically, to an ally that has now just become a vassal. And this is how vassal states behave. And this is the fate that they also meet.
Completely agree with you. But just one question on that. How do you square the circle? Because I have heard a number of commentators talk about how the GCC aren't happy, they're moving towards China and various other things. But how do you square the fact that once again they've basically put an order in for almost $7 to $8 billion of more American military-industrial complex equipment?
I don't see that as a contradiction, because what I think is going to happen is that they're actually going to spend more money on American weapons, but they're not necessarily going to pay for the rebuilding of these bases, and that the bases will no longer necessarily be the center of that relationship. And on top of that, they will start binding new security agreements with other states, with Turkey, with Pakistan, perhaps with India, perhaps with China, perhaps with other European states. The issue is never that they would or should abandon the United States. It's about diversification and not being entirely dependent on one power, which they by and large have been. So I think you will see that, and as part of making sure that the diversification actually doesn't see as is not read as hostile towards the United States, they will likely spend more money on U.S. weaponry, but less money on other things from the United States.
That makes sense. Now, we've seen, obviously, we've talked about it now. I'm just reading another report that the IGC just came out and said that they hit a USS destroyer. Obviously, that needs to be verified, but this is the claim directly from them. We are seeing escalation occurring in the Strait of Hormuz. There was quite a bit yesterday, and each day is more than the previous day. So reports now, I had Larry Johnson on just before you, and he said that his sources are telling him there was some engagement on the 5th, then it slightly increased on the 6th. Yesterday we saw quite a bit of engagement, and today already, since we've woken up, there's been quite a bit of engagement. It does seem like this engagement and the kinetic action in the Strait is increasing. A, what's your thoughts on that? And B, you seem to be more of a believer that there's probably going to be a deal, but does that seem to suggest that there could be escalation and a possible return to kinetic warfare?
Let me just clarify. I'm not saying that the likelihood of a deal is more than 50%. I'm just saying that there had been some progress in the last couple of days, and that may be delayed or jeopardized because of exactly what you pointed out, that we're seeing an escalation. Whether this is the two sides, feeling each other out, testing each other out, testing new red lines, etc., or whether it is something more elaborate than that, or perhaps even something accidental, which is it started off with some accident and then now the two sides are just firing back at each other and it leads to an unintended escalation. It's not entirely clear to me. We have very little information, and most of the information we have oftentimes turns out to be false or misleading or exaggerated. So if you just take a look what the US side said early on in the war about, how many times 90% of Iran's own launchers had been destroyed, etc. And now we see that the US intelligence leaks their reports, which shows that they have more than 50 or 70% of their launchers still intact. Iran inflicted far more damage on American bases than ever was acknowledged. So oftentimes in the moments, you have to be very, very careful about the information that comes out.
Totally agree with you. But in terms of the engagement on the Strait of Hormuz, you think that this could escalate? And what I mean by that is obviously logically it can escalate. But based on your understanding of what's happening with the deal, based on your understanding of this very important meeting with China, and from my understanding and many people I spoke to, Iran is kind of, and I just had Larry Johnson who said something similar, that Iran, China and Russia have told Iran to kind of just not escalate too much. They want the meeting, especially before the meeting. How do you foresee all those different aspects to this current dilemma that we see over the next few days?
The Iranians are going to be careful not to entirely anger Russia and China, but also I don't think they're going to take any diktats from them, nor will they provide any such strong pushes. The Chinese, I think, played a role in convincing the Iranians to show up in Pakistan. The Iranians are very skeptical about ceasefires with the United States. I think that the ceasefire that did come into place disproportionately favored the U.S. until the U.S. shot itself in the foot with the blockade on the blockade. Again, I think there is a very significant likelihood that this can escalate. I'm tending to go in that way, even if there actually also has been some deconflicting, that it nevertheless gets out of control. I think some of the language coming out of Trump is extremely unhelpful. The diktats that he's issuing, the Iranians better do this or something, those kind of threatening language is not the approach that is needed, particularly if you're making diplomatic progress and you need some sophistication to get it over the finishing line. That language is not helpful. In fact, if that language had been helpful, U.S.-Iran relations tensions would have been resolved 47 years ago. There's a reason why they haven't. Many reasons. But one of them is this idea that you can just threaten that country into submission. We've seen now that we've even tried war in order to get them into submission, and that too has failed. So we clearly need to have a different approach. Obama did, and he was successful. It's stunning how little the foreign policy establishment is willing, not that they can't, is willing to learn from the one successful negotiation the United States has had with Iran in the last 47 years.
One other question I got for you, Tree, and I know you need to head off in a few seconds, but the question is this. We saw Iran hit a number of vessels in the Strait of Hormuz, and yet there's been no casualties. So it seems like they've been more precise in the attacking the vessels. But today, just a few hours ago, the United States of America targeted 2 Iranian vessels, and there were 5 people who were killed. What's your thoughts on this kind of American attack on innocent Iranians? And it's not just that. We saw it in Venezuela. We've seen it in Iran. This kind of lack of acknowledgement. There's lack of morality when it comes to targeting innocent civilians.
Yeah, I think this is a pattern that we've seen, as you pointed out, in Venezuela as well, that Pete Hegseth has been extremely explicit about. He is not, these are not accidental deaths. These are deaths as a result of Pete Hegseth saying that he's not going to conduct war in a woke way any longer. Essentially saying that decades of rules and norms around the use of force that were put in place by the entire international community, in which the US was a very active and important participant, out of learning of how horrible war was in World War II, in which all of humanity wanted to put into place rules and norms to make sure that we would never go down that path again, in which the lives of civilians were just so unprotected in war. He's essentially explicitly saying that he wants to undo all of that. That is in some ways the Israelization of American approach to war, because this is exactly what Israel has been doing for quite some time. And Israel has rejected many, many aspects of international law, not just this, for quite some time, in which it wants to have the benefit as a stronger military power to be able to conduct itself more or less how it wants. We have seen the deliberate, systematic destruction of the norms of use of force and international law by the Israelis live on TV for the last 3 years. And we've seen how most of Europe, not all, but the vast majority of Europe has just completely laid down, pretending to be dead and allowing this to go forward. And then it's been picked up by the Trump administration and that by Pete Hegseth. The world we will live in, if this ends up becoming the norm, if other countries follow suit, is an absolutely terrible world. It's not limited to Iran or to Venezuela.
Totally agree with you, Trita. Trita, I want to just thank you so much for taking your time out to join
us.
Thank you. Appreciate you as always. Where can people find your work? And obviously, we'll put your X link on as Trita Parsi, but where else can people find you?
I'd love for folks to go to my Substack. I'm starting to invest much, much more effort into that. So that is at Trita Parsi. They can go to the Quincy Institute's website, which is quincyinst.org, as well as to my Twitter, as you mentioned, T Parsi.
Brilliant. Everyone should be following you, Trita. Thank you so much for
Thank you so much for having it. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was Trita Parsi. Guys, make sure you give him a follow. Follow him on X. We're going to put a link out, T Parsi. Also, follow him on, on his Substack. Follow him on Substack. And like this video, comment in this video, share this video, put your notifications on. Go to the notifications. There's a bell. You click the bell on and put all on. Have your notifications on this YouTube channel. And follow my Substack as well. Follow my Substack. We have a very good article coming out tonight. Hopefully, I'm going to finish it. I've already done the research on it. It's about the UAE, exposing them. So watch out for that. But that being said, follow Trita as well on his Substack. Great guy, great person. That being said, guys, we've got another great guest coming on. It is going to be Ian Proud.